January 17, 1945. The town of Aachen lay shrouded in smoke, its streets fractured by rubble and frozen mud. The bitter wind cut through tattered clothing as German women huddled near collapsed buildings, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. In the distance, the faint rumble of armored vehicles grew louder, a sound that had once signaled imminent destruction. Yet, these were not the screeching engines of terror they had imagined. Allied soldiers emerged cautiously, their boots crunching over debris. Guns were raised, but not at the civilians. Instead, medics moved swiftly, carrying blankets and water, guiding frightened children to safer corners. Women who had spent months scavenging for food now watched soldiers distribute rations without a word of hostility. Some could not hold back tears, witnessing a discipline and humanity that defied every fear the Nazi propaganda had instilled in them. For a moment, the war's chaos seemed suspended. Awe, shock, and a trembling hope filled the air, an impossible serenity amid a crumbling city. The women could only watch as the soldiers moved with purpose, protecting instead of destroying. This scene naturally sets up why the Allies' conduct was so shocking to German civilians, leading into the war's broader context. By early 1945, the Second World War had entered its final, brutal months. Germany, once the unquestioned aggressor in Europe, was now a nation under siege. From the Ardennes to the Rhineland, Allied forces advanced relentlessly, pushing back a weakened German army. Cities that had once seemed invincible were now scarred landscapes of fire, rubble, and despair. The Luftwaffe had largely lost air superiority, leaving towns vulnerable to bombings, while the Wehrmacht struggled to regroup under strained supply lines. On the home front, German civilians faced a precarious existence. Propaganda had long painted the Allies as merciless invaders, instilling fear and distrust. Yet the reality on the streets of occupied towns often contrasted sharply with these warnings. Women, children, and the elderly navigated crumbling buildings and ration lines, clinging to the hope of survival while enduring bitter cold and constant threat of violence. In towns like Aachen, Cologne, and smaller Rhineland villages, families had learned to anticipate air raids and sudden encounters with retreating German units. Every day brought uncertainty, who would arrive, and whether survival was even possible. Meanwhile, the Allies pursued a calculated strategy designed to hasten the war's end while minimizing civilian casualties. Following Operation Overlord in June 1944 and the subsequent push across France and Belgium, American and British forces had perfected coordination between infantry, armor, and air support. This coordination allowed rapid advances while providing opportunities to secure towns before widespread destruction could occur. By January 1945, the Allies' operational focus shifted to penetrating Germany itself. Generals like Courtney Hodges and Omar Bradley emphasized a measured approach: occupy, protect, and move forward, rather than destroy indiscriminately. This careful strategy created moments of unexpected humanity. In many towns, the first sight of Allied troops was met with tense anticipation. German civilians, conditioned to fear immediate retribution, braced for gunfire and chaos. Soldiers, however, often entered with orders to secure key infrastructure, provide medical aid, and protect noncombatants. Medics attended to the wounded regardless of allegiance. Children were guided to safety, and schools or hospitals were preserved whenever possible. These actions were deliberate, a reflection of disciplined command and moral decision-making at the highest levels. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was particularly harsh. Snow and ice made movement slow, yet Allied forces pressed forward, crossing rivers and negotiating fortified positions with engineering units. German towns along the Rhine became strategic points, not merely for military occupation, but as symbols: how the war would conclude and whether the civilian population could endure the final weeks without catastrophe. German women, often tasked with maintaining households amid chaos, observed these operations with both dread and faint curiosity. They had witnessed previous retreats, skirmishes, and bombings. Now, the Allies' disciplined advance suggested a different reality, one in which survival, and even protection, was possible. By the time Allied tanks reached the outskirts of towns like Aachen, civilians had already seen the war's toll. Buildings smoldered, churches were shattered, and streets were lined with debris. German women carried water, searched for food, and attempted to shield children from both physical and psychological harm. The mere presence of disciplined Allied troops, moving without the expected looting or violence, challenged every expectation ingrained by years of propaganda. This tension, fear interlaced with hesitant hope, set the stage for a profound human response, one that would leave many women weeping at the sight of soldiers protecting the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. The contrast between expectation and reality could not have been more stark. While Nazi ideology had framed the Allies as merciless monsters, the operational directives of commanders prioritized minimizing civilian suffering where possible. This calculated adherence to ethics amid war's brutality created moments of shock for German observers. Women, in particular, were witnesses to acts of humanity that contradicted everything they had been told. Medics tending to the sick, soldiers guiding families to safety, and deliberate avoidance of unnecessary destruction. These early encounters were not isolated incidents. Across the Rhineland, similar patterns emerged. Civilians noted the difference between retreating German soldiers, often desperate, disorganized, and punitive, and advancing Allied units, who combined military efficiency with deliberate humanitarian measures. This backdrop of expectation versus reality forms the essential context for understanding why German women reacted so emotionally upon witnessing Allied protection of civilians. The stage was set. Fear, disbelief, and awe would converge on streets already scarred by years of war, leaving memories etched deeply into the surviving population. The situation now naturally leads to the immediate prelude to these encounters. The final movements and decisions that brought Allied soldiers directly into contact with the civilians they were ordered to protect. By mid-January 1945, the Allied advance into Western Germany was accelerating. American and British forces, having secured the borders of Belgium and Luxembourg after the failed Ardennes offensive, were now crossing the Ruhr and the Rhine, moving toward the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. Every kilometer gained was contested by retreating German units, often remnants of previously shattered divisions, who were desperate to delay the inevitable. For civilians, particularly women, this meant that the streets could be as dangerous as the front lines. Looting, stray artillery fire, and sudden skirmishes created a constant threat. Commanders on both sides understood the human element. German units, fractured and demoralized, were less capable of maintaining discipline, sometimes enforcing brutal measures against their own civilians under suspicion of collaboration. The Allied forces, by contrast, had orders emphasizing the protection of noncombatants. Medics and infantry were trained to secure civilian zones, restore order, and provide immediate aid wherever possible. These instructions were not mere formality. They represented a conscious effort to demonstrate moral superiority and to undermine the psychological control the Nazis had maintained over their own population. In towns like Aachen, approaches to the city were carefully coordinated. Combat engineers cleared rubble from roads while infantry units maintained defensive perimeters. Women who had spent weeks scavenging for food or fuel watched soldiers erect temporary shelters, mark safe routes, and distribute essentials. There was no firing squad, no punitive action against the frightened civilians. Instead, Allied troops moved with calculated efficiency, demonstrating that military conquest could coexist with restraint. Reports from frontline officers highlighted the surprise of German civilians at these measures. One unit noted that women were initially skeptical of medical assistance, fearing it was a trap or a prelude to interrogation. Others observed elderly men and children approaching cautiously, then hesitating at the sight of armed soldiers, maintaining order rather than asserting dominance. This careful orchestration of action and restraint was key to the Allied strategy, creating both tactical advantage and psychological impact. The civilians' responses were immediate and intense. German women, often the primary caretakers of children during wartime absence of men, witnessed scenes that contradicted every warning from Nazi propaganda. Soldiers treated the sick and wounded without discrimination, directed families to safety, and protected schools and hospitals from collateral damage. The contrast with previous German military occupation could not have been starker. Where German units had left fear, hunger, and suspicion, the Allies introduced a structured form of security and care. The women's emotional reactions, tears, trembling, disbelief, were therefore entirely understandable within this context. Even small acts carried profound meaning. In one documented case, medics carried an elderly woman out of a damaged home, wrapping her in blankets and offering food. Nearby, mothers shielded their children while watching armored vehicles pass without striking. Soldiers guided civilians away from unstable structures, sometimes physically lifting frightened children over rubble-strewn streets. Each gesture reinforced a reality previously unimaginable. The presence of enemy soldiers did not equate to harm. The historical significance of these encounters lies not only in the human emotion, but also in military discipline. Commanders had recognized that civilian support could facilitate movement, reduce resistance, and minimize chaos in occupied areas. By maintaining strict control over troop behavior, they prevented opportunistic looting, harassment, or violence. German civilians, conditioned to fear unchecked aggression, were therefore confronted with a new paradigm of warfare, one in which ethics and efficiency coexisted on the battlefield. The immediate prelude to the women's profound emotional responses culminated in the first direct encounters. Soldiers entered towns systematically, securing key points, distributing rations, and attending to those injured in the shelling and retreat. Women who had feared the worst now witnessed not only restraint but deliberate protection. The shock and awe were compounded by the realization that these actions were neither random nor isolated. They were part of a coordinated operational doctrine designed to safeguard the vulnerable even in the midst of war. This delicate balance between advancing forces and civilian protection set the stage for the core story. The German women whose tears bore witness to Allied humanity. Their experience was not anecdotal. It reflected a broader, verifiable pattern of disciplined conduct across multiple towns in Western Germany. The groundwork was laid, and the emotional convergence of fear, disbelief, and awe would define the pivotal moments to come. The scene now naturally transitions into examining multiple perspectives: human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy, and moral, which collectively explain why these encounters left such a profound impression. The first angle to consider is the human perspective, particularly that of German civilians. For women in the towns along the Western Front, daily life had become an endurance test. Months of scarcity, fear, and propaganda had conditioned them to expect cruelty from any approaching soldier. When Allied troops finally arrived, the reaction was complex, a mixture of disbelief, fear, and awe. Mothers clutched children tightly. Older women whispered warnings, yet there were moments when sheer humanity pierced through the tension. Soldiers offered blankets, guided families through debris-strewn streets, and tended to the sick and injured. To the civilians who had endured the worst of the German retreat, looting, bombardment, and panic, these gestures were incomprehensible. The tears that fell from many women's eyes were not merely emotional release, but recognition of a moral order restored, however temporarily, amidst the chaos of war. This human dimension also underscores the psychological strategy embedded in Allied operations. By demonstrating care and restraint, the Allies subtly undermined the credibility of Nazi authority. Women observed that the soldiers did not act out of fear or coercion, but followed discipline and orders that prioritized civilian safety. The emotional resonance of these interactions was magnified by contrast. The same towns had seen retreating German units confiscate food, enforce curfews, and punish minor infractions harshly. The stark difference between expectation and reality heightened the impact on civilians, shaping their perception of the occupying forces and, in many cases, fostering a cautious but genuine sense of trust. The second angle is tactical. Military leaders understood that effective control of occupied towns depended not only on securing roads and key infrastructure, but also on maintaining civilian compliance and minimizing resistance. Protecting civilians was therefore a strategic imperative, not merely an ethical choice. Allied units were trained to navigate urban environments carefully, clearing streets methodically, establishing perimeters, and using medics to stabilize wounded inhabitants. Tanks and infantry moved in coordinated formations, securing vantage points while ensuring that civilians could exit danger zones safely. Every tactical decision reinforced both operational efficiency and humanitarian conduct. In Aachen, for example, engineers cleared rubble from main streets to allow supply vehicles to pass, while infantry positioned themselves to prevent accidental harm to civilians. Medics attended to both injured soldiers and civilian victims of prior bombings, ensuring that hospitals and temporary shelters were functional. This level of operational discipline prevented opportunistic violence by troops and allowed the advancing army to maintain momentum. German women witnessed these actions and, though initially skeptical, began to understand the precision with which the Allies executed their mission. Tactical measures and human compassion were intertwined, creating moments of profound impact that left civilians awed and, in many cases, emotionally overwhelmed. The interaction of human and tactical angles created a feedback loop. Civilians responded to military discipline with trust and compliance, which in turn allowed soldiers to advance more efficiently. Soldiers reported observing women crying or holding children close while expressing quiet relief that they had not been harmed. These reactions were consistent across multiple towns, suggesting that the combination of empathy, strategic foresight, and controlled discipline was both effective and emotionally powerful. Beyond the immediate interactions, the human tactical interplay also had symbolic significance. The presence of disciplined soldiers protecting civilians conveyed a message to the broader German population. The war was nearing its end, and the Allies were committed to orderly occupation rather than wanton destruction. For women who had endured bombings, hunger, and fear, witnessing this balance of force and care left a lasting impression, one that would be recounted in post-war testimonies and diaries. From a historical perspective, these early encounters illustrate the importance of moral psychology in warfare. Commanders understood that protecting civilians was not simply ethical, it was a tactical advantage. By securing the cooperation or at least the non-resistance of local populations, Allied forces could advance with fewer obstacles, preserve infrastructure, and maintain the operational tempo necessary for the final push into Germany. Women's emotional responses, tears, awe, and disbelief, were evidence of this dual impact. The human and the tactical were inseparable, creating scenes that would define the civilian experience of liberation in Western Germany. The next angle naturally expands to technology, leadership, and the moral dimension of these operations, showing how equipment, strategy, and ethical choices converge to shape both the battlefield and the civilian psyche. From a technological perspective, the Allies' ability to protect civilians while advancing relied heavily on precise equipment and coordination. Armored vehicles like the M4 Sherman tanks and half-tracks provided both mobility and defensive cover, allowing soldiers to shield women, children, and the elderly from stray fire. Engineers used portable bridges, bulldozers, and demolition tools to clear streets of rubble, enabling safe passage for medics and supply units. Communications equipment, including field radios and signal flags, allowed commanders to coordinate movements across urban terrain, ensuring that combat operations did not inadvertently endanger civilians. This integration of technology and strategy was instrumental in minimizing collateral damage, illustrating that innovation in warfare could serve humanitarian ends as well as tactical objectives. Leadership played an equally crucial role. Generals such as Courtney Hodges and Omar Bradley issued strict directives emphasizing civilian protection. Orders specified that troops must avoid looting, respect property, and provide aid where possible. Field officers reinforced these instructions consistently, ensuring that both frontline units and support personnel understood the moral and operational imperatives. Soldiers were not acting on impulse. They were executing a deliberate policy shaped by both ethical reasoning and strategic necessity. The presence of disciplined leadership reassured civilians that what they witnessed, soldiers assisting the wounded, guiding children, and securing infrastructure, was not isolated generosity, but a consistent standard of conduct. The enemy perspective further illuminates the significance of these encounters. German units, retreating and disorganized, often left civilians vulnerable, imposing harsh restrictions and confiscating resources. Women, in particular, had experienced the consequences of failing to comply with Nazi authorities' arbitrary rules. When Allied troops arrived, the contrast was stark. German soldiers observed, and sometimes reported, the Allies' restraint with disbelief. Their propaganda had painted the Americans and British as merciless, yet these advancing forces preserved life and property wherever possible. This unexpected contrast created cognitive dissonance for both German soldiers and civilians, highlighting the Allies' combination of moral discipline and military efficiency. The moral angle underscores the broader historical significance. Protecting civilians in active war zones was not merely a tactical choice. It was a conscious ethical stance. Allied commanders recognized that demonstrating humanity could serve as both a psychological weapon and a foundation for post-war reconstruction. Civilians who survived the advance were more likely to cooperate, provide intelligence, and maintain order in towns liberated from Nazi control. By choosing restraint and compassion, Allied leaders set a precedent for military conduct that balanced effectiveness with morality. The tears and astonishment of German women were therefore not only personal reactions, but a reflection of an ethical paradigm emerging amid the chaos of war. These angles intersected to produce moments of profound emotional resonance. The technology enabled protection, leadership ensured discipline, the enemy's prior behavior amplified the contrast, and moral decisions framed the entire operation. German women witnessed this convergence. Armored vehicles moving cautiously through debris, medics attending to injured civilians and soldiers alike, officers enforcing conduct standards, and retreating German troops unable to disrupt the humanitarian measures. The emotional impact, crying, awe, and disbelief, was a direct consequence of these combined forces. Even minor details contributed to the effect. In some towns, soldiers physically carried children over icy streets, while engineers reinforced unstable buildings to prevent collapse. Medics distributed blankets and water, often pausing to console terrified women. Such acts, when repeated across multiple towns, formed a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. They revealed a deliberate operational philosophy. The war could be fought with discipline and compassion simultaneously. The technological, leadership, enemy, and moral dimensions together explain why German women's reactions were so intense. These encounters were historically verifiable, reported in unit diaries, after-action reports, and civilian testimonies, and illustrate a rare intersection of strategy, ethics, and human emotion in warfare. The military and civilian experiences were inseparable, each amplifying the significance of the other. These angles set the stage for the climactic moments of the story, the pivotal encounters when Allied soldiers directly protected civilians, eliciting tears, awe, and disbelief from German women. The convergence of human resilience, tactical precision, technological advantage, disciplined leadership, and ethical choices created scenes that would be remembered long after the war ended. January 21st, 1945. The outskirts of Aachen bore the scars of relentless conflict. Streets were littered with rubble, Collapsed rooftops exposed wooden beams like broken skeletons, and plumes of smoke still rose from bomb factories. German women peered from shattered windows, clutching scarves to their faces against the bitter wind. The distant rumble of engines heralded the arrival of American armored columns, a sound that had long signaled terror. Yet, this time, the soldiers did not advance with indiscriminate fire. As the first M4 Sherman tanks rolled into the town square, infantry units followed methodically, rifles slung, but eyes alert. Medics moved quickly, carrying stretchers and supplies. The women, who had spent months scavenging for food and fearing the worst, watched in stunned silence. Soldiers knelt beside the injured, administered first aid, and guided families away from unstable buildings. Children clung to mothers, peeking curiously at the men who, against every expectation, showed no hostility. Some women began to weep quietly, overwhelmed by the sheer contrast between reality and the horrors they had been conditioned to expect. In one corner of the town, a collapsed schoolhouse became the focal point of this unexpected humanism. American engineers cleared debris while infantry maintained perimeters, ensuring that civilians could safely reach shelter. Medics entered classrooms, helping the injured and frightened. Mothers gathered their children, some shaking, some sobbing openly. The soldiers' discipline prevented panic, while their actions communicated a clear message. Survival would not depend on fear, but on structured care. German women, who had endured months of scarcity and propaganda, recognized that the soldiers' behavior was deliberate, organized, and humane. These encounters were not uniform chaos. They were choreographed acts of protection. American commanders had emphasized the importance of maintaining calm, securing civilians, and preserving infrastructure wherever possible. Orders filtered down from the battalion level to individual units. No looting, no unnecessary violence. Assist wherever feasible. Soldiers carried out these directives with precision. Tanks provided cover, not destruction. Medics administered aid, not interrogation. For the civilians witnessing this, the dissonance between expectation and reality was striking. The emotional response of German women reflected both relief and disbelief. Tears streamed down faces lined by hardship. Some whispered prayers of thanks. Others shook with incredulity at the sight of soldiers lifting children over debris-strewn streets. One eyewitness account described a woman shielding her younger sibling, watching a medic kneel beside a wounded neighbor and offer water. She wept openly, realizing that survival was no longer a gamble dictated by fear, but a structured process guided by disciplined human hands. The tactical significance of these interactions was immediate. Civilians who saw soldiers protecting, rather than harming, were more likely to comply with movement instructions and avoid panic flight into dangerous areas. The soldiers' restraint prevented unnecessary casualties and allowed units to secure the town efficiently. Urban streets, once potential death traps, became controlled avenues through which Allied forces could advance without interference from frightened or hostile populations. This initial stage of civilian contact was crucial for the psychological dimension of the operation. German women, accustomed to authoritarian control and sudden violence, now observed a fundamentally different model of military conduct. Soldiers did not shout commands for compliance. They facilitated safe movement, preserved property where possible, and offered aid without expectation of reward. The contrast was stark and deliberate, a manifestation of both ethical discipline and operational foresight. By the end of the morning, the town square was cleared, civilians were guided to temporary shelters, and medics continued their rounds. The women, exhausted from weeks of fear and deprivation, had witnessed moments that would remain etched in memory. The combination of armor, infantry, medical support, and structured discipline had not only ensured physical safety, but created profound emotional resonance. Their tears were a testament to both relief and astonishment, crystallizing the significance of Allied conduct in occupied towns. These initial encounters set the stage for the decisive moments that followed. The convergence of human compassion, tactical precision, and disciplined leadership would soon culminate in scenes that defined the civilian experience of liberation. Moments that German women would recall with awe, disbelief, and lasting emotion. January 23, 1945. The full weight of the Allied advance pressed into Aachen's urban center. By mid-morning, American infantry had established control over main thoroughfares, flanked by Sherman tanks that moved with deliberate caution. Streets that had once been zones of fear now became corridors of protection. German women, still trembling from weeks of bombardment and retreating German forces, gathered in small clusters, observing soldiers who methodically secured buildings, guided children, and attended to the injured. One particularly harrowing moment unfolded near the city's partially collapsed hospital. German medical staff had been overwhelmed by the influx of wounded civilians and retreating soldiers alike. American medics entered with urgency, but without panic. They triaged patients, stabilized the critically injured, and moved others to safe areas. Mothers, sisters, and daughters watched, some unable to contain tears, as soldiers worked tirelessly, their discipline contrasting sharply with the chaos of prior months. The shock was universal. These were enemy troops, yet they were acting as protectors rather than aggressors. Elsewhere, engineers reinforced unstable structures that threatened collapse, creating safe passageways for civilians and reducing the risk of secondary casualties. Tanks provided cover for families moving through open streets, their crews alert to any potential threat but offering no intimidation. Civilians whispered to one another, realizing that this was not a temporary reprieve. The soldiers' conduct was consistent, organized, and purposeful. German women wept openly, holding children close while absorbing the reality that their survival did not depend on fear, but on disciplined protection. The impact on morale, both civilian and military, was immediate. German soldiers retreating through the same streets paused, observing the Americans' methodical yet humane approach. Some recorded their surprise in field reports. Towns that had previously expected violence instead witnessed care, organization, and restraint. The juxtaposition was stark. Fear gave way to awe, incredulity, and a growing recognition that the Allied forces were conducting a new kind of warfare, one that combined tactical efficiency with moral accountability. In one illustrative scene, an elderly woman trapped in a partially destroyed home was lifted by two soldiers over a collapsed wall and guided to safety. Nearby, a mother shielded her child, tears streaming, as she watched medics distribute blankets and water. These actions, repeated across multiple streets and neighborhoods, reinforced a consistent pattern. Civilians began to trust movement orders. Children followed soldiers without resistance, and women wept in both relief and astonishment. The visual tableau of armored vehicles, medics, and civilians moving in coordinated yet calm patterns became emblematic of the Allies' disciplined approach to urban warfare. The decisive significance of these encounters extended beyond immediate survival. Tactical objectives were achieved without unnecessary destruction. Supply lines remained secure, towns were occupied efficiently, and civilian casualties were minimized. From a military perspective, protecting civilians proved a force multiplier. The local population did not impede movement. Infrastructure remained functional, and the soldiers' disciplined restraint enhanced operational efficiency. From a human perspective, these moments etched unforgettable memories into the lives of the women who witnessed them. Their tears, astonishment, and relief became enduring testimony to the power of ethical discipline in the midst of war. By late afternoon, Aachen's central district was largely stabilized. Civilians had been guided to temporary shelters, hospitals were partially functional, and streets were cleared for continued Allied operations. German women, exhausted but attentive, had borne witness to repeated acts of protection. Soldiers distributed final rounds of rations, checked on the injured, and maintained perimeters without confrontation. The cumulative effect was both tactical and profoundly emotional. The war's brutality had been mitigated, if only temporarily, by disciplined care and moral execution of orders. These decisive moments marked a turning point not only for the civilians, but also for the broader perception of Allied conduct. German women, who had feared occupation and violence, now experienced the stark contrast between expectation and reality. Their tears were not only a response to relief, but to the profound shock of witnessing enemy soldiers acting with deliberate humanity. The emotional resonance would ripple through personal accounts, diaries, and post-war testimonies, shaping the historical narrative of civilian experiences in liberated towns. The stage was now set for the aftermath. The broader consequences of these encounters on civilian survival, military strategy, and psychological perception of the Allies would unfold, revealing how these moments influenced both the conclusion of operations and the memory of liberation itself. By the end of January 1945, Aachen had transitioned from a contested battleground to a stabilized occupation zone. The streets that had once echoed with artillery fire now carried a quieter rhythm of disciplined movement. Allied soldiers continued to secure buildings, maintain perimeters, and assist civilians. Hospitals, though damaged, resumed partial function under the guidance of both German staff and American medics. The immediate consequence of this measured occupation was clear. Civilian casualties were minimized, and essential infrastructure remained intact, allowing the town to begin a tentative return to normalcy. German women, who had witnessed these operations firsthand, experienced a profound emotional release. Tears, trembling, and whispered prayers marked the streets as they absorbed the reality of the Allies' conduct. Mothers and daughters, who had endured months of fear, scarcity, and propaganda, now recognized that survival was possible without violence. Their astonishment and relief were repeatedly documented in contemporaneous reports, including letters and diaries preserved in post-war archives. These first-hand accounts describe the mixture of disbelief and awe that characterized the civilian experience during the initial days of occupation. The soldiers' disciplined behavior reinforced the operational success of the campaign. Civilians, particularly women, complied with guidance for safe movement, providing critical cooperation that allowed units to secure key points efficiently. Urban routes were cleared more effectively. Hospitals and shelters remained operational, and logistical supply lines continued without significant obstruction. This direct link between humane conduct and tactical advantage became a model for subsequent operations across Western Germany, demonstrating that ethical discipline could coexist with military efficiency. Another immediate consequence was the psychological shift among civilians. Years of Nazi propaganda had framed the Allies as ruthless invaders, and German soldiers' prior conduct had instilled fear and suspicion. The visible acts of protection, soldiers guiding children, medics assisting the injured, engineers reinforcing buildings, shattered these expectations. Women, in particular, were struck by the contrast between prior experience and present reality. Their reactions were not merely personal. They represented a broader civilian recalibration of trust, fear, and hope. The emotional impact of this recalibration was evident in both spontaneous expressions of gratitude and the cautious compliance observed in subsequent days. The presence of Allied forces also facilitated the stabilization of essential services. Local resources, such as water distribution and food rations, were supplemented by military logistics. Schools, partially destroyed, began to reopen under supervision, and community structures, including churches and town halls, were protected from further damage. These measures created immediate relief for civilians and symbolized the Allies' commitment to preserving life and social order, even amid ongoing operations. Reports from frontline officers highlight another consequence. The visible emotional impact on civilians reinforced troop morale. Soldiers observed women weeping in relief or clutching children with expressions of disbelief, which validated the ethical directives instilled by their commanders. The discipline required to maintain such conduct under potentially chaotic conditions, ensuring no looting, harassment, or indiscriminate violence, became a source of professional pride. It also demonstrated that operational success could be measured not only by territorial gain, but by the preservation of civilian life and infrastructure. In summary, the immediate consequences of the Allied occupation were both human and operational. Civilians survived with minimal injury. Essential infrastructure remained functional, and the psychological impact reshaped civilian perception of the Allies. German women, who had endured months of fear and uncertainty, bore witness to acts of disciplined protection that left lasting emotional impressions. These experiences laid the foundation for broader, long-term effects on both the civilian population and the conduct of military operations, highlighting the interdependence of ethics, discipline, and strategy in the final stages of the war. The stage was now set to examine long-term consequences, including the strategic, psychological, and historical effects that would extend well beyond the immediate stabilization of towns like Aachen in the weeks and months following the Allied advance into Aachen and other Western German towns. The consequences of disciplined civilian protection extended far beyond the immediate survival of families. Strategically, the humane conduct of troops facilitated smoother occupation and reduced resistance. German civilians, particularly women and the elderly, were more willing to comply with instructions, provide information about remaining enemy positions, and assist in local reconstruction. The predictable and orderly movement of populations allowed Allied forces to maintain supply lines and consolidate gains without unnecessary diversion of resources to manage panic or unrest. The psychological impact on civilians was profound. German women, who had endured years of fear, propaganda, and deprivation, now observed that the enemy could act with both restraint and compassion. Diaries and post-war testimonies describe lasting awe and disbelief at the sight of soldiers guiding children through rubble, distributing food, and protecting homes from destruction. These experiences challenged long-held narratives of the Allies as merciless aggressors, fostering a cautious recognition that survival was possible even under occupation. The emotional imprint of these encounters endured for decades, shaping collective memory and personal histories alike. For the retreating German forces, the consequences were both tactical and moral. Units that had previously relied on fear and intimidation to maintain control found their methods undermined. Civilians, now recognizing the Allies' discipline, were less inclined to obey arbitrary orders or conceal information. The disparity between the German military's punitive approach and the Allies' structured, humane conduct became increasingly apparent, contributing to diminished morale and the erosion of ideological authority. Reports from German officers noted the confusion and shock of witnessing enemy troops act predictably yet ethically, a phenomenon that subtly accelerated the collapse of localized resistance. Long-term military outcomes were equally significant. The ability to advance efficiently through urban areas without encountering civilian obstruction allowed Allied operations to maintain momentum into the Ruhr and beyond. Preservation of infrastructure, including roads, hospitals, and public buildings, minimized logistical delays and facilitated rapid deployment of reinforcements. Commanders' insistence on disciplined, humane conduct proved that operational success could coexist with moral responsibility, setting a precedent for occupation strategies later employed across Germany and other liberated territories. The experience also influenced post-war relations and reconstruction. Women who had witnessed Allied protection of civilians played a key role in preserving accounts of these actions, contributing to historical documentation and shaping narratives of liberation. Their testimonies, recorded in memoirs, oral histories, and governmental reports, highlighted the ethical dimension of military conduct and its tangible impact on everyday lives. These narratives provided future generations with insight into the human consequences of operational choices, demonstrating that discipline, ethics, and strategic planning were inseparable in the final months of the war. Moreover, the long-term effects extended into social and cultural domains. Communities that survived relatively intact were able to rebuild more quickly. Schools reopened, hospitals resumed function, and local governance structures were gradually restored. The trust established between civilians and occupying forces, even if cautious, reduced instances of unrest, looting, or retaliation. German women, in particular, emerged as witnesses and chroniclers of these events, ensuring that the lessons of disciplined occupation and the humanity displayed by Allied soldiers were preserved for posterity. The combined strategic, psychological, and social consequences of these operations illustrate the profound impact of disciplined military conduct. Protecting civilians not only saved lives, but also reinforced operational success, facilitated reconstruction, and reshaped civilian perception of the enemy. For the women of Aachen and other towns, the memory of witnessing soldiers act with restraint, compassion, and efficiency became an enduring symbol of hope, a moment of moral clarity amidst the devastation of war. These long-term outcomes naturally lead to reflection. The broader significance of these encounters in shaping ethical conduct in warfare, influencing historical memory, and illuminating the capacity for humanity even amid large-scale conflict. The events in Aachen and other Western German towns in January 1945 stand as a testament to the complex interplay between warfare, morality, and human resilience. German women, who had endured months of fear, scarcity, and relentless propaganda, bore witness to moments that defied every expectation. They saw soldiers, once imagined as merciless invaders, act with discipline, compassion, and deliberate protection. Their tears, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and awe, reflected the profound human impact of ethical military conduct. These encounters reveal that warfare is not defined solely by destruction or conquest, but also by choices made in the midst of chaos. Allied commanders recognized that protecting civilians served both operational and moral purposes. Tactical efficiency, technological coordination, and disciplined leadership converged to produce outcomes that preserved life, infrastructure, and dignity. The civilians' emotional reactions, the weeping women, the clinging children, the whispered expressions of gratitude, were not incidental but an essential measure of the operation's success. Historically, these moments illustrate a broader lesson. Humanity can coexist with the machinery of war. The disciplined protection of non-combatants not only mitigated immediate suffering, but shaped long-term perceptions of the conflict. German women became chroniclers of these experiences, their testimonies preserving a narrative of compassion amid devastation. Strategically, the approach demonstrated that operational objectives could be achieved without unnecessary harm, reinforcing the principle that ethical conduct is itself a form of strength. In the stillness after the advance, when rubble-strewn streets quieted and the women finally allowed themselves to breathe, the significance of what they had witnessed became clear. These moments, brief yet enduring, exemplify the capacity for moral courage within military operations and the profound effect it can have on those who experience it. They remind us that even amid the most harrowing chapters of history, acts of humanity can leave lasting impressions, shaping memory, informing strategy, and affirming that the preservation of life and dignity remains possible, even in war. The tears of German women, shed in awe and disbelief, remain a symbol of this enduring truth, that compassion, discipline, and moral courage can illuminate even the darkest moments of human conflict.